In the early 1960s, the Supreme Court outlawed prayer and Bible reading in public schools. That generation has now grown up and entered the workplace. And last October, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, what a misnomer for an organization, issued proposed regulations to eliminate God from the workplace, would silence all religious expression. Their guidelines say that it would be illegal to wear a cross around the neck, to display a religious object on a desk or work area, to have conversations about religion, or have a Bible on an employee's desk, or display a picture of Christ, or even having a Christmas party. What started out just to be a politically correct thing back in the early 1960s has now become the main thrust of the government, if you can imagine. With the Clinton administration, Christian bashing has become the latest American sport. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me what may be an omen.
Indeed it may be. The guidelines of which J.R. just spoke have as their goal to create a, quote, religion-free workplace. What a paradise, a religion-free workplace. But you know, Paul prophesied that this was going to come. In his last letter, really, 2 Timothy, the 3rd chapter, opens by saying, "This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come." Perilous times comes from the Greek word kalepos, which may be translated ragingly insane. Everything's going to be turned around, upside down. That which is good will be made to seem bad, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And those are the times. This tells us what time it is, doesn't it, J.R.?
I think it does. Here's an article, for example, in the USA Today Baseball Weekly that talks about the God Squad, religion in the clubhouse in baseball. Divine or divisive? And of course the thrust is Christianity is divisive. Christianity is no longer divine. Christianity is incompatible with our American society. Recently, the governor of Texas said that the radical religious right were a danger to our American culture. And CNN had a program, a news piece recently on the religious right in Minnesota, saying that we were trying to impose our prejudices on our society. Absolutely incredible, Gary, that everything has turned from us being the good guys now. Christians are the bad guys.
The age of apostasy, prophesied in the New Testament, is upon us. Congress and the Senate recently passed a what can only be called anti-Christian legislation, making it a federal crime to protest the slaughter of innocent babies in the United States abortion mills. We have this in the June 1994 prophecy in the news. Americans have been rained upon. Christian Americans are bearing up under a storm of legislation.
Christians are sitting in jail today because they went ahead and picketed abortion clinics in spite of the government's new ruling.
Just look at the list. We have abortion on demand, homosexuals in the military. We have federalization of federalization of educational policy. In other words, one federalized institution is going to cram our children's heads full of a particular program. We have tax hikes to finance the whole thing, which bring crushing economic problems. And in the wake of that, they're now talking about taxing the church itself.
Yes.
So what can we say?
Yes, one couple recently were charged with $13,800 by the Internal Revenue Service. They went bankrupt, but because they were tithers of a particular local church, and the government ruled then that for their tithe, they got nothing in return. See?
Yes.
And because they got nothing in return, the federal government is going after the church to divvy up that $13,800 on behalf of that couple.
Which
absolutely strange.
It's a direct assault on the separation of church and state, because the state is now raiding the church in many different ways, not just financial. As a matter of fact, they're beginning to rule in areas of doctrine, saying that During an election year, for example, if a pastor stands up and makes the wrong kinds of statements about some candidate, he's electioneering and he's violating his tax-free charter, and his church might just have its tax-free status removed. We're hearing talk like that, J.R.
Yes. In fact, back in 1987, a tax-exempt status was removed from a church organization and was only recently reinstated. During that time, they asked that church for $2.6 million in back taxes simply because the government decided that they wanted to remove the tax-exempt status. There are the Branch Davidians that were cleared of most of the charges in their trial in San Antonio or Austin. And the fascinating thing is they are about to receive a sentence now for what charges that did stick. And we have an article here from the Associated Press in Austin. The jury, forewoman in the murder conspiracy case against 11 Branch Davidians, has asked the federal judge who will be sentencing the defendants to be lenient. So the woman who headed up the jury that that found them guilty of these lesser charges and not the main charges the government was trying to seek, are asking the judge to be lenient. But according to the article here, these people are going to receive at least a minimum sentence of 30 years just on weapons charges, if you can imagine such a thing. So I think this is a deliberate attempt by the government to silence. You know, Gary, this big fire that was started, rumors were that it was the fault of the government and the Clinton administration, but the spin doctors have turned it around and have said, no, the Branch Davidians, that is the Christians, are guilty of this big fire that killed so many people.
You know, J.R., there are a number of fringe area groups that call themselves Christian.
Yes.
We have the Church Universal and Triumphant, Elizabeth Clare Prophet. We had the Church of Jim Jones in San Francisco that moved to Guyana a few years ago. These churches, I think, are unfortunate deviations, but what they have provided is a way for the government really to get into the legitimate churches. They have provided a crack, shall we say, or a foot in the door, or the camel getting his nose in the tent.
Yes.
Because though they may not have been legitimate in and of themselves, though they may have been doing some things that were desperately wrong in some cases, nevertheless, the camel now has its nose in the tent. The government is now nosing into legitimate Christian organizations.
Yes, and Christians are being made to look like we are an inferior people, that we are a danger to our culture. That the religious radical right is trying to impose our prejudices. When other groups picket the government, they are simply trying to ask for freedom of expression. But when Christians run for public office or voice any opinions on political subjects, political topics, then we are accused of trying to impose our prejudices on our American culture.
Don Feder has written in an editorial, the anti-religious nut in your office might just soon be able to cry harassment over anything even remotely spiritual. The employee who, number one, has a picture of Jesus on his desk, or number two, might give a biblical tract to a receptive colleague in the office, or number three, an employee who hears about someone who is sick and says, I'll pray for you, or the husband maybe of an employee says, I'll pray for your husband.
Yeah.
That individual, J.R., could be charged with religious harassment under federal guidelines. Staggers the mind.
It really does. Now that takes us back to the Word of God. You know, the Christian religious harassment that we are having today from the government, freedom of religion is a thing of the past. We are now second-class citizens. Reminds me of first century Christianity and the Roman hierarchy who launched a tirade against Christians. I want to read Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. When God talked to Eve, after Eve, having listened to the serpent, had committed sin, God says, I will put enmity between thee, as he speaks now to the serpent, between thee, the serpent, and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Indicating here, Gary, that Jesus Christ is the seed of the woman, but that one day there will be a seed of the serpent. That sounds like a genealogical lineage, doesn't it?
It really and truly does, J.R. It talks about, and of course the man would be the Antichrist. The seed of the serpent could be none other than the Antichrist. And so there must be some kind of a genealogical lineage. As we look at Revelation 17, and we see the story of 7 kings, I think we get a hint of this. Revelation 17:10 says, "And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come, and when he cometh he must continue a short space. And the 8th beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition." Cryptic language, J.R., but it's talking about the seed of the serpent, the Antichrist, and it's linking the Antichrist possibly to the lineage of the Roman emperors.
Now, we want to talk to you today about one of those first century Roman emperors, and the fact that first century Christianity considered him to be the Antichrist, the seed of the serpent. And to begin with, Gary and I would like for you to see just a clip out of a Hollywood movie that talked about this Antichrist today. It's the movie called The Omen. Let's roll the clip. Now watch this. This archaeologist goes to meet another archaeologist on the shores of the Mediterranean in northern Israel.
Do you recognize him? No. Haven't you seen Yigale's wall yet?
Well, it was only opened up last week.
There are 4 faces of the Antichrist on his rise to power. The face of Yigale, Satan as a child, is the same.
The same? What are you talking about?
There is no doubt. Damien Thorne is the Antichrist. Now, Michael, you must believe
The
me.
guy doesn't believe
You
him.
can't expect me to believe it.
Then come to Yigale's wall.
Yes, the wall.
But now?
Now.
Right now. So they enter this tunnel of an archaeological excavation, and they come up against a wall and find a picture, 1,000 years old picture of the Antichrist. What does he look like? He looks like a modern human being, Damien Thorne.
Look.
It is him.
The devil is there.
The Antichrist is with us.
They die.
Then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and destroy with the brightness of his coming.
In the movie, they found a 1,000-year-old picture dubbed the Antichrist. And that picture looked like somebody living in their day, Damien Thorne. That brings us to the subject at hand, Gary, the subject of the Antichrist. If we are experiencing all of this Christian bashing today, is it possible, since we live in what we feel is the last generation, the Antichrist is behind all of this?
Well, you know, J.R., there's a lot of public consciousness, I think. The Omen was made in 4 parts, 4 full-length Hollywood motion pictures dedicated to the unveiling of the Antichrist. This Damien Thorne character in The Omen was a handsome young man who was placed sort of through
yeah, he came from a jackal.
Subterfuge. Placed him in the household of a major political figure, and he was ushered into global politics. Now, in the secular world, there's this consciousness that maybe there is an Antichrist living today. That's the idea advanced by the movie. And it's an idea, by the way, that has roots that go all the way back to the Caesars.
Yeah, now this cryptic statement that you read here a few moments ago in Revelation 17, the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th and is of the 7 and goeth into perdition. How can we look at such a thing, and what kind of cryptic statement is it trying to make?
Well, in Revelation 17, John is told that there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is. There will be another who comes for a short time, and then there will be an 8th man who's an Antichrist. And some have said those 5 who were fallen were the 5 emperors of the Julio-Claudian line. They were Julius Caesar, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. And Nero was the last of the Julio-Claudian line. And then during John's own day, when he wrote Revelation, Domitian was on the throne, so he was the one who is. Then there would be another, and then the 8th man, who is called of the 7. That is, he seems to be of the same seed as the emperors of the Julio-Claudian line. But the interesting thing to me is that the Bible calls attention to that 5th man, who would be Nero.
Nero. Now, it was under Nero's edicts that the Apostle Paul was beheaded and Peter was crucified in Rome. And so we have a monster of a man here we're talking about, the 5th emperor of Rome. And he was called by the first century Christianity the Antichrist.
Yes,
Let's
he was.
discuss why, Gary.
Well, first of all, his behavior, which we're going to discuss in a moment, was absolutely abominable, and history placed him in a position of being the persecutor of Christians. Therefore, he became really the first of the Roman emperors who actively pursued and persecuted Christians. Now, Nero committed suicide in AD 68 on June the 9th.
It's kind of interesting that it was on June the 9th, don't you think?
With all the talk about June the 9th lately, maybe it is interesting. But you know, immediately upon his death, a theory arose, which in Latin is called Nero revividus, meaning that Nero is not dead, but he's coming back again. And I'm reading here in Walter K. Price's book, The Coming Antichrist, and by the way, we offer this to our viewers. It's a good book. The essence of the Nero revividus theory is that Nero did not actually experience death, but escaped from Rome and took refuge in the East. And Suetonius and Tacitus, Roman historians, both speak of this belief being strong among the people. And by the way, it was even strong among Christians.
A rumor.
It was a rumor that spread, and Christians of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, even the 5th century said that Nero was going to rise again. In fact, as Walter Price points out, the belief that Nero would return was still in existence in the 5th century AD, for Augustine makes reference to it, saying, others again suppose that he, Nero, is not even dead, but that he was concealed, and that he might be supposed to have been killed, and that he now lives in concealment in the vigor of that same age which he had reached when he was believed to have perished, and will live until he is revealed in his own time and restored to his kingdom. That's Augustine saying.
5th century, Augustine was saying Nero is the Antichrist, and one day Nero will return.
Yes. And
he will carry out the prophecies of the Antichrist. That's incredible. Gary, the Zondervan Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible talks about Nero being the Antichrist by changing his name, Caesar Nero, to Hebrew, and using the numbers of the Hebrew letters, Kaiser Neron, as it would be in Hebrew, with the Kaf, the Samik, the Resh for the Kaiser. That would be Kaf being 100, the Samik 60, and the Resh equaling 200. And then the Neron would be the Nun with a value of 50, Resh with a value of 200, the Halom, the Vav representing 6, and a Nun representing 50. And voila, we've got 666 here on the name, the Hebrew rendering of the name.
Kaiser Neron.
Caesar Nero. Fascinating,
Caesar Nero. And you know, the new Christians, of course, were conversant with Hebrew. And they were familiar with the idea of transliterating or transposing letters to numbers in Hebrew. And along came the writing of John and talked about 666 being the number of his name. Snap, there it is. It all fits together. And what's amazing to me is that Revelation 17, speaking of the 5th emperor, and that Augustine, speaking of the Nero revividus theory still being alive in the 5th century, the seed of the woman that starts way back in Genesis and is hinted at in Revelation 17. You put this all together, J.R., and you have, what do you have?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is a picture of Nero. This is a statue of the Caesar Nero. He's the man who killed the Christians. In fact, there were rumors that he had started a big fire, but his spin doctor immediately said, no, it's the Christians. They're the ones that are guilty. And they arrested the Christians and charged them with this. Tacitus, the local spin doctor in Rome, said, quote, with this view, he inflicted the most exquisite tortures on those men who, under the vulgar appellation of Christians, in other words, Christians were second-class citizens in those days, were already branded with a deserved infamy. The Christians, listen to what he says, the guilt of the Christians deserved indeed the most exemplary punishment. And so they died in torments, and fascinating that Christians were less than human, according to the Roman Tacitus.
And he also records that they illuminated Nero's garden parties. Christians bound to stakes were smeared with bituminous material and set aflame. And the people laughed when this happened. Sometimes they were sewn into the skins of animals and thrown before the lions. Nero had lots of fun with Christians, and he well deserves his title of Antichrist, by the way. He was, you can look at it historically and say that he was the first real world-class Antichrist. And we have his face right here on the table between us.
And even as late as the 5th century, religious historians and theologians were saying that someday this man will come back and become the Antichrist.
Look at that face, J.R. You know, I'm looking at the boyish good looks here. We have a...
you know, it's interesting. He was a musician.
Yeah, poet.
And he was an athlete.
Yeah, he liked to run.
But he was bisexual.
Yeah.
And an exhibitionist.
That's true. You know, you look at the picture of Nero, the sculpture of Nero, and you're struck by a kind of a boyish face, really, kind of an innocent face. But those are cold eyes. I want you to know, you're looking at the face of a cold-blooded, cold-hearted man.
Fascinating that he was called a buffoon because of his temper tantrums.
Right.
And
rages.
In fact, he exterminated many of the people who were around him when they found out evil things about him. And some of them, he claimed those deaths were suicides.
That's correct.
That's incredible, isn't it? Wow. If you know somebody or you ever see anybody that looks like this, beware.